Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I hope you're all safe, sound, and healthy. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment, and welcome to yet another session of Carnegie Connects, a series of virtual conversations on issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Today's session is particularly timely, how a Biden administration will react to the world, and perhaps more important, how the world will react to a Biden administration. Even though foreign policy was not high in the agenda of voter priorities and preferences in the last election, it's clear that a change in administration policy is going to have a fundamental impact in how America sees and deals with the rest of the world. The mere fact that Biden isn't Trump, I suspect, will go a long way toward injecting a certain measure of predictability and consistency into U.S. policy. But a couple of other points need to be made. One, Joe Biden is going to face probably the greatest challenge of national recovery of any president since Franklin Roosevelt. His bandwidth for foreign policy, at least on paper, at this moment, will seem to be very narrow. I can count 4 or 5 interlocking crises, from a pandemic that is surging to the prospects of not just economic recession, but structural impediments and impairments in the economy that have even the greatest of economists scratching their heads. Polarization along class, political, and racial lines, and a loss of faith in American institutions. But there's also the paradox of the foreign policy issue, that a president, often bogged down in domestic policy, sometimes has a degree of maneuverability abroad that could free them up to do things. Second, I think we'd have to admit, as all of our panelists would, that the world's changed. COVID is probably the most transformative event, world-altering event since the Second World War. And I guess I would argue that it has not left the world in a better position. It's reinforced trends that undermine multilateralism, globalization, international cooperation, and it's reinforced other trends, a preoccupation with national sovereignty when it comes to border security, health issues, and the economy. And I think it's left a much tougher environment for problem solving. Our focus today, I suspect, since we're 70 plus days away from inauguration and likely to encounter a pretty turbulent period between now and then, is less on the detailed policies of what a Biden administration would pursue, but how the various international actors in the international system today, or at least the 3 or 4 we're dealing with, might react to what promises to be a pretty important change in how America deals with its allies and adversaries. So I have many questions. How do our allies and adversaries view America after 4 years of Donald Trump? Is Donald Trump a headline? Or is Trumpism, if there is such a thing, even without Trump, a trend line? George Packer recently argued in a piece in The Atlantic that America is now 2 countries, neither of which can be conquered, and neither of which is likely to disappear. So will this kind of polarization and tribalization of American politics permanently damage America's reputation as a reliable partner? Is there a perception in Europe, in Asia, in Middle East, Iran specifically, that a Biden administration would itself be an aberration until 2024, when the wheel might turn again in a fundamentally different direction? And can America lead? You know what they say, that a leader without followers is just a guy or girl out for a walk. Are people going to follow us? What kind of credibility do we have? And finally, do our allies and adversaries, what do they want from a Biden administration? And even before inauguration, what surprises may emerge from the Trump administration or from any of these actors during what promises to be a turbulent transition? As usual, I'm in the lucky and fortuitous position of not having to answer any of these questions. But fortunately, we have 3 brilliant Carnegie analysts and scholars who can. Rosa Belfour is director of Carnegie Europe. Her fields of expertise range from European politics and their institutions and foreign and security policy. Evan Feigenbaum is vice president for studies at the Carnegie Endowment, where he oversees research in Washington, Beijing, and New Delhi on a variety of issues, a dynamic region encompassing both East Asia and South Asia, not just China. And I'm hoping Evan will zoom his lens a bit wider today. And of course, Karim Sajapur, one of the leading analysts in this country and abroad on Iran, is a senior fellow at Carnegie, where he focuses on Iran domestic, regional, and of course on U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East. So 5 minutes each. Rosa, since you have the Herculean challenge of summarizing an entire continent, I wonder if you could start us off.
To be here. So I think Europe, as you said, 27 EU member states plus Britain. So there's a lot of ground to cover. So let's try and be brief. On Saturday evening for us, so when the announcement was made, the positivity and sense of joy was overwhelming. Most of the leaders issued deeply felt, heartfelt congratulations to Biden. So the leaders of most European countries were overwhelmingly happy. And since then, we've seen a lot of hopes being raised that, you know, a Biden administration will finally bring to an end these 4 years. But let's go into a little bit more detail. Some governments in Europe had actually invested quite a lot on the Trump administration, the first being Britain, and Britain will have to adjust. It's the likelihood of a quick US-UK trade deal to offset Brexit and the UK leaving the EU is less likely right now. So London will really have to adjust and bring out some positive things to put on Biden's agenda, because it is expected that Biden will lean more clearly towards the EU and towards Paris and Berlin. Other countries that will also have to adapt include Hungary and Poland, whose leaders are fans of Trump, and they represent, you know, pocket-sized Trumpism, as someone put it recently. I thought it was quite an apt definition. Now they're quite worried that if Biden embraces the rhetoric of return to democracy and fundamental principles and values, that these countries will actually be in the spotlight in Europe because they have been moving away from democracy and human rights. But overwhelmingly, the governments in Europe, they have really brought out their strong transatlanticism and look forward to working with Biden and with the Biden administration, and probably their very high expectations, possibly too high, of working together again on climate, on fighting the coronavirus pandemic, JCPOA. There's a long list of things that European governments would like the US to get involved in, and which admittedly in the past 4 years, they haven't been very quick and prompt at responding to the challenges that Trump posed to Europe directly, not just indirectly. But it will be hard also, I think, for Europeans, because in these 4 years, the image of the US has also gone down in public opinion. So Europeans will also, the European governments will also need to persuade European publics that they really need to invest in this transatlantic relationship if we want to fireproof it from, as you say, 2024 Trump or another cloak of populism returning to the US. Let's not forget that Europe has very similar problems. I mentioned Hungary and Poland, but also France, 2017. I've noted parallels between Biden's speech and Macron's speech when he won, where he said, I'm going to be the president of all the French people, including those who didn't vote for me. Deeply polarized country back in 2017. In 2 years' time, there will be new elections. And this is happening across the continent. Italy has had a populist government as well, which fell over a year ago. But, you know, there were Trump fans in that. There are Trump fans in political party leaders in Italy and across the spectrum. And it's quite striking. Again, I had a look at public opinion data, Pew Research, how the image of Trump shot up in far-right parties in Europe during the past 4 years. So the problems that the US will need to confront in terms of polarization that you were mentioning, well, European societies are also going through these as well. and perhaps Britain with Brexit is the example of the most tribalized, divided society, especially in the, between 2016 and now, where now Brexit has become a reality. But until then, there was a lot of wishful thinking that the referendum could be reversed and that the UK could return to the EU. So in a nutshell, as I said, overwhelming, a plurality, a majority of governments deeply happy, high expectations that the Biden win will be transformative. A little bit of wishful thinking, which is a risk if that leads to not addressing what the real priorities need to be, both in the transatlantic relationship and in terms of Europe's priorities. And then yes, the survival of Trumpism and populism, which needs to be addressed, I think, in similar measures across the two sides of the Atlantic.
Rosa, thank you. Insightful and very economical. A lot of ground to cover. Thanks so much. Kareem, let me turn the virtual floor to you.
Thank you so much, Aaron. It's great to be with you all. I'd say that in Iran, the reaction to Biden's election was a sense of relief among the population that is probably the most sanctioned population in the world, but a reaction of cynicism by the leadership of the Islamic Republic of Iran. I usually just pay close attention to what the supreme leader says, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. He is the longest serving autocrat in the world, arguably, certainly in the Middle East. He's been ruling since 1989, certainly the most powerful figure in Iran. And he immediately greeted the election of Joe Biden with tremendous cynicism, saying this was essentially a farce and a fiasco, not just for the United States, but for liberal democracy. So I think like Russia, like China, a lot of our authoritarian adversaries, they're trying to paint this as a defeat for liberal democracy. And I'd say that this is just a reminder about three of the tenets of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Number one is that Iran's enmity towards the United States is bipartisan. So it's not only against Donald Trump, it's also against Democrats as well. Number two is that opposition to the United States is really one of the few enduring pillars of the 1979 revolution. The other two being opposition to Israel and the mandatory veiling for women, the mandatory hijab. So death to America is really, this is my third tenet about Iran, is that it's really central. Opposition to the United States is really central to the identity of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, I'd say that on a popular level, there is a sense, I don't want to call it enthusiasm, but I think there is a cautious hope that even if that there will be at a minimum a de-escalation. No one in Iran wants conflict, and there was tremendous fear of conflict after the assassination of Qasem Soleimani in January 2020. And as I said, a mild hope that perhaps if we can't go back to status quo ante of the nuclear deal, that maybe some half measures that would reduce this, tremendous economic sanctions under which people are suffering. But, the bottom line for the United States is that I think it's going to continue to be quite difficult for a Biden administration to try to make amends and reach a rapprochement with a regime in Tehran which continues to need the United States as an adversary for its own internal legitimacy and security.
Kareem, thanks. That really was terrific. Listening to you, it's a real combination of thematic altitude and granularity. And thanks so much. Evan, thanks. China and Asia.
All right, well, let's start with China. First, it's good to be with you and colleagues. It was interesting listening to Rosa talk about the high expectations in Europe for a Biden administration. I think in Beijing, the expectations are probably pretty low. For the better part of 3 years, the US-China relationship has essentially been in free fall. I've been in this business 25 plus years. I've had trouble finding the floor. And if I can't find the floor, I'm guessing the Chinese have had some trouble finding the floor as well. Would they like a reset? Of course they'd like a reset, but they're nobody's fools. And I think they can see the trend lines in the United States. There's really been a wholesale change on a bipartisan basis, frankly, in Washington, in the way the US looks at China and the way the United States looks at strategic competition with China. Some people have said maybe a Biden administration would rewind the clock back to Obama's China policy. I think that's very unlikely in light of these kinds of structural and political shifts. If you rewind just 6 years to, say, 2014, the United States and China were negotiating a bilateral investment treaty. They had just reached a major climate agreement on hydrofluorocarbons. They were working together in the last major pandemic, which was the Ebola crisis. You even had American and Chinese scientists working side by side and medical personnel in Sierra Leone in West Africa. And if you fast forward 6 years to today, these things are almost unthinkable given the political context in both countries and the strategic competition that we see. I think basically two things have happened. The Chinese recognize them. One is that economics and security have essentially collapsed together. And so where commercial flows of goods, capital, people, technology, and data essentially ran in a parallel line from the security competition, those two things have bled together. And now, particularly on the American side, all of those commercial flows are refracted through the prism of national security. So Chinese investments are viewed through a security prism. Any Chinese entity that touches Americans' personal data in any way, TikTok, WeChat, these things are seen as a national security threat. So there's that. But then second, the Trump administration has pioneered the use of tools, including a much more elastic view of what constitutes national security. And the use of things like export controls, the Commerce Department's so-called entity list, things that are designed to alternatively punish China, but also change the incentives and disincentives for American entities and third-party entities to pursue co-innovation and commercial relationships with China. They've changed those things very significantly, and I think the Biden administration will continue to use some of those tools. So I think on the American side, what we're going to see happen is the Biden people, unlike the Trump people, are systematizers and they're multilateralists. So they will systematize the use of some of those tools where the Trump team tended to use them in a more ad hoc kind of way. They're multilateralists, which means they will seek to coordinate with Japan and the European Union in the first instance, both around the commercial issues the United States has with China, but also potentially around some of the security issues as well, from investment screening to shaping norms, standards, and rules around things like freedom of navigation and trade. And then they'll have to deal with what to do about President Trump's tariffs and also how to treat the climate issue, which of course will come back to the fore in a Biden administration in ways that it was not in a Trump administration, and which offers an opportunity, I think, in Beijing to have at least a modest reset by finding one issue that the two sides can zero in on and put a floor under what I described as the free fall.
Evan, thanks so much. It's a lot to think through, and it's a really terrific integrated presentation. I want to start in the Q&A. Rosa deals primarily with U.S. allies. The two of you deal with U.S., I don't know how I would describe them, adversaries. Frenemies may be too generous a term, I don't know. But I guess the question is, for me, if both perceive Trump, at least the Chinese may have, as an agent of American decline. I don't know, Kareem, whether or not that's how the Iranians perceive it, but an argument could be made that that's the case. What do they see as the real advantages of a Biden administration? More predictability, more consistency, more flexibility? I mean, these are adversarial relationships, which even under Obama weren't, I mean, I'm not sure you could use the word rapprochement, but what's in store? Are we talking about, Evan, your term, managed enmity? Is that really where we're going, at least for the first year or two of a Biden administration, managed enmity? Evan, you want to start?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think so. And that's why I've used the term. I think people talk a lot about strategic competition, but there's a difference between competition and enmity. I mean, to me, competition means trying to outdo the other guy. You invest in yourself, you win by being better, and not everything is zero sum. when you're actively trying to obstruct each other, which is what the United States and China have been doing for the better part of 2 years, and Beijing is guilty of that in many ways. What you have is a relationship of enmity, not competition, albeit within some guardrails, which is why I call it managed enmity. I think there are people in China who look at the United States and they may see what they perceive as decline. They see China contracted 6.8% in the first quarter, but they've returned to growth earlier than any other major economy. And they have other things going for them as well. They have the map in Asia, where they're geographically contiguous to other subregions of Asia, something that is an advantage they have. They have a model of project finance around things like infrastructure that the United States has not been able to compete with. China may have at least one, maybe multiple vaccine candidates that they've already indicated they want to leverage potentially for strategic purposes with certain strategically chosen countries around the world. Just look at countries like the Emirates, where they're doing vaccine trials now. I think those countries are very carefully chosen, and they're not just chosen for vaccine-related reasons. So I think if you're sitting in Beijing, you probably look at the United States and you see that you have some competitive advantages. Having said that, competition with China is not rocket science, and I think there are ways that the United States could compete much more effectively than it has been. For one thing, it's withdrawn from its traditional role as a standard setter around trade standards, investment standards, technical standards, and nature abhors a vacuum, and it's ceded that space over the last few years to China, particularly in Asia, in ways that have unsettled American allies and have allowed China to shape the play. That is reversible. And my view is the United States could compete much more effectively. And since you asked me to broaden the lens, that's essentially what American allies and other partners around the region are looking for. They're deeply ambivalent about the rise of Chinese power, but they can't fight the map. They got to live with China every day in perpetuity. China has a certain economic gravity that exerts in the region. But I think countries all around Asia would like to see both a doubling down on the American security presence, but also the United States get back in the economic, technical, rule and standard setting game in a way that isn't just designed to shoot nasty grams off at Beijing, but actually leverages American strengths in much more concerted, strategic and systematic ways. That's the challenge for the Biden administration.
Thanks. And Kareem, managed enmity, I mean, given your basic three premises, I mean, it seems to me that would be the default position. But is there anything better that can be done, do you think?
Aaron, I think managed enmity, contained enmity captures it well. And your question is a good one, because it reminded me to say something I'd neglected to say, which was one of the things that the Supreme Leader said shortly before our presidential election was that America is basically on the verge of demise. American decline has set in. Donald Trump was an example of that, and that essentially the U.S.'s days are numbered. It's a country which is so polarized that it's ripe for civil war. And I've been following Ayatollah Khamenei's speeches for many years now, and he had in the past kind of alluded to this idea that America is a declining empire which will eventually implode, but the frequency with which he said these things has certainly increased. Now, I would say that there's both an advantage and a disadvantage for the Islamic Republic of a Biden presidency. An obvious advantage is that, as you alluded to, more predictability. It's not going to be an administration which assassinates Iran's top military commanders, as the Trump administration did. It's going to be an administration which is more focused on rebuilding the United States, nation building at home rather than external adventurism. So I think, and obviously, a potential return to either the full nuclear deal or kind of a halfway measure, a freeze for fees, would offer Iran some sanctions relief, the ability to sell its oil again. So all of that is an advantage of a Biden presidency. I think there is one disadvantage. There's probably more than one, but one disadvantage which I think is notable is that the last 4 years, Donald Trump was essentially a caricature of the ugly American for a lot of American adversaries, especially the Islamic Republic of Iran. And it was kind of easy for Iran to win the court of both international public opinion and domestic Iranian opinion. You know, for years, the Islamic Republic of Iran had tried to tell their people that, you know, we're not what stands between you and a better future. America is what stands between you and a better future. For years, the Iranians had tried to convince the Russians, the Chinese, the Europeans that America is the problem, not us. That's going to be much more difficult to do with a Biden administration. And I know that you know, some Iranian opponents of the regime are concerned that President Biden is going to take a somewhat more conciliatory approach towards Iran than Trump. There'll be less pressure on Iran in a Biden administration than a Trump administration. But again, the challenge will be for the Islamic Republic is that they will no longer have the pretext of Donald Trump and, you know, American pressure to explain away all of the mismanagement and corruption and economic decline. So I think it's a mixed bag. Biden administration is a mixed bag for the leadership in Iran.
Yeah, one small question, Kareem, before I turn to Rosa to talk a little about allies rather than adversaries. When you talk about de-escalation, short of full return to the Iran nuclear, to the JCPOA, limited sanctions relief on our side in return for...
You know, I think you could see a scenario whereby, as you said, on our end, let's say the sanctions are a 10 out of 10 right now, we reduce it to a 7. And on their end, they've expanded, they've advanced their nuclear program fairly significantly since the JCPOA was signed. And they wouldn't necessarily be going back to status quo ante. Again, if they're at a 10 now, they're not going to go back to a 1, but maybe they go back to a 5 or a 6. Right. You know, I think that some folks in the Biden administration see that as a potentially more realistic option, especially in the near term, rather than an immediate return to status quo ante. And I should also add, Aaron, here that you know, in Congress, this is one of the most polarizing issues for members of Congress. So the results of the Georgia elections will be very important, whether or not Democrats or Republicans have a Senate majority. And it's also worth noting that there wasn't an internal consensus among congressional Democrats about the JCPOA. As you remember, you know, very powerful, influential Democratic senators like Chuck Schumer, Bob Menendez actually opposed the JCPOA. And so a lot of things are going to be determined by how Iran reacts to a Biden presidency and the makeup of Congress.
Kareem, thanks. Rosa, now to you on allies. Two questions. Is there I mean, Europe has its own leadership problems and transitions, obviously. Is there a natural partner for Joe Biden? I mean, he's a guy who's been around the block more than a few times with respect to his knowledge of foreign policy and his personal relationships with European leaders. Of the big three, I mean, if you remove Britain, I don't know what's going to happen to Angela Merkel, but is it France? I mean, is it Macron because he offers himself up as a sort of leader and political center of gravity? Is that America's natural partner as Europe struggles with the issue of strategic autonomy and the like?
That's a good question. So you mentioned London, and I think, you know, the UK will have to learn to live with the fact that it's not going to be interpreting Europe for America any longer. So, and America needs to find strengthen relationships with other interlocutors. And you rightly point out, there are going to be elections in 2021, September 2021 in Germany. So Angela Merkel is not going to be around for much longer. But I do think she's going to play a role in shaping up what will be done through the transatlantic relationship early on. It is widely expected that Biden will pay a visit to Europe in early 2021, if anything, to restore credibility to NATO and reassure NATO allies. And I think that will be the opportunity for Europeans and Americans to make a big statement about, you know, recommitting to the transatlantic relationship. And, you know, then the work needs to start. I mean, this would just be more for the optics of reestablishing the relationship. But you're right to point to France. Macron has another year in office, well, another 7 months compared to Angela Merkel. There'll be elections in May 2022. But also, if you look back to the end of the latter part of the Obama presidency, France and the US were increasingly working together on a hell of a lot of security dossiers, such as in North Africa, in the Sahel, in the Middle East, both militarily and in terms of security. And Germany has very little power and influence and credibility on all matters related to security. So it could well be that France will emerge as the partner of preference, especially on certain issues with respect to Middle East and security, anti-terrorism, etc. So that's very good intuition. But France is also the country that is most. I mean, it's most, I don't want to say ambivalent, but somewhat has ambiguous sentiments with respect to transatlanticism. It is the country that has been trying to push the European Union towards gaining what it calls strategic autonomy. There's this debate that has been going on, mostly in think tanks and in the sort of Brussels bubble and Paris and Berlin, about strengthening Europe's capacity to act alone. Obviously within the framework of the NATO commitments and the allies, but France is really the only country that has been pushing this. Germany and other powers are quite happy with the arrangements with NATO. They're quite happy in most cases, for the US to take the lead, whereas France wants to be much more of a shaper. So while on the one hand, France could be the partner of preference, there will have to be some kind of agreement that if Europe, through a French push, ups its role in the world, then the US will also have to accept that. And there's been a bit of a dialogue here going on, especially with the Trump administration. Trump was continuously criticizing European leaders for not pulling their weight on security and defense. And then when Europeans would start talking about things such as the European army, the US administration said, no, we don't want you to do that. So, there'll have to be a kind of shift in the terms of the discussion, the transatlantic discussion, which I actually think would be a positive outcome, because it's important for Europe to end its position as junior partner in the transatlantic relationship and try to, step up its own responsibilities in partnership with the US.
Right. We had a question. Thanks. We had a question for you, Rosa, from YouTube on the issue of populism. Now, I'm not sure how to pose this because, well, the question was, would Trump's defeat have an impact on the strengthening or emergence, strengthening would be a better word, I think, of populist trends in Europe? But since this election was more a rejection rather than a rejection of Trump rather than a repudiation of that sort of, nationalist, America first populist approach, what do you think? What did you call them? The pocket-sized populists? Is Trump's departure going to make a difference for those countries?
No, I think, first of all, I think populism, Trumpism, it's not just about leaders. It's about deep trends within our societies that need to be fixed. And in order to fix them, our governments need to take a hard look at economic inequalities, identity issues, ethnicity issues. I mean, it's complex, it's complicated, and it's not going to end with the end of a leader. So that's the first point, and this applies to Europe as well. So, the elections we're talking about in France, I mentioned 2017. The next round will also be tough, and Macron doesn't. There aren't many other mainstream leaders, potential leaders in France. So the far right will have another good opportunity. So that's the first thing. But then let's think a bit about Trump's impact over the past few years. It has done a lot to embolden the populists in Europe. It has he has supported them. He has supported the divisions that populist leaders in Europe thrive upon. So they blame Brussels for everything to beef up their domestic pollings, and so he has he has supported those trends. So in that sense, the absence of Trump will give a bit less ammunition, shall we say, to the populist leaders, but it won't kick them off the throne. The third point, which is I think it's quite interesting, that in countries like Hungary and Poland, they are talking about, they are expecting a Biden administration to come up to become more vocal on issues with regard to human rights, democracy, and the state of their countries. Now, I'm not 100% sure that Biden will have the bandwidth to look at domestic politics in Hungary and in Poland.
Yeah.
I fear that there's a bit of wishful thinking that Biden's election will directly change the situation in those countries. I think it's really down to citizens there, and Polish women have shown that they can actually make a difference. And also, of course, it's down to the EU. But having a vocal supporter of democracy in the White House will make a difference in terms of image, in terms of it will make in terms of the image of what it is to be the democratic West. And I think that even though we're talking about the declinist narratives, even though the West is in relative decline, I think it still retains that attraction which other countries such as China, Russia haven't managed to compensate with their alternative, sort of techno-surveillance authoritarianism. They haven't managed to be as attractive. And I think the result, the elections, and, we were all glued, my whole family was glued to CNN in unprecedented ways for hours and hours, and impressed at, the resilience of the democratic process in the US. And I think this is shared quite widely amongst Europeans. We've seen, Europeans have been watching, should we say moderate Europeans have been watching in horror what's been happening in the US for the past 4 years, but they've also drawn much inspiration from the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter. And so there's an image question there, which will counter the populist narrative that will no doubt be exploited by the myriad of far-right populist leaders we have in Europe.
Thank you. Evan, before the question for you from Maya on Facebook, let me remind our viewers that if you want to ask a question, use the live chat feature on YouTube or on Facebook, or tweet us at Carnegie Endow using the hashtag Carnegie Connects. So on trade, Evan, the Biden administration's view and policies, TPP, some other alternative? Maya wants to know.
Yeah, I mean, well, obviously, I would love the United States to return to TPP for the reasons that I said earlier about being a standard-setting nation. The United States likes to talk a lot about an Indo-Pacific strategy, but within 3 to 5 years, trade and investment standards in Asia are likely to be set by 2 agreements, the TPP, now called the Comprehensive and Progressive TPP, and Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And neither of those agreements includes India or the United States. So the largest economy in the Indo and the largest economy across the Pacific are out. So what kind of Indo-Pacific when you don't have the Indo or the Pacific in? I think that's the core of the problem. My former boss in the State Department, and yours too, Aaron, Rich Armitage, former Deputy Secretary of State, used to say to get China policy right, you got to get Asia policy right. And I think one thing Rich meant by that was do not make your entire Asia policy derivative of your China policy. Get the Asian pieces right. I think if you talk to the Trump people, their view is that they're doing great in Asia because they've toughened up on China, and that's essentially what the region wants to see. I think that is what the region wants to see. But there's a widespread view in the region that many of the Trump administration's actual policies were not consistent with an approach that emphasized strategic competition with China. And the trade is the key. The trade is the key part of that, because if the United States wants to just be a security provider while taking itself out of this economic standard rule and norm setting realm, it's going to find itself quickly eclipsed by a region where even if the region isn't Sino-centric, it is Asian-centric, and the United States is on the outside with its nose pressed against the glass. So that is a challenge. And I'm skeptical that the Biden administration, given the trade skepticism in both parties, is going to be able to navigate the politics of that. But I very much hope they will, and I would encourage
this one's for sort of a double question for Kareem and you, Evan. And I know neither of you wants to speculate, but I'm going to ask it anyway. We are entering what could be a potentially, well, it's already been disruptive, unnatural, abnormal transition. I've been through a half dozen transitions, and without even experiencing this one or watching it from afar, this is going to be like none other that we've ever seen, at least in the modern period in American history. So I guess my question, and we've talked about it, so you knew it was coming for both of you. We have 70 plus days until an inauguration. I tend to be a sort of moderate on this one because I looked at election day in America, and despite all of the predictions of catastrophe and meltdown and structural demise and the post office inability to do this, that, and the other, it actually worked. The next issue is contestation, whether or not you may see serious contestation by the Trump administration, you may not. So during the transition, question, do you foresee, either of you with respect to China, Evan, or Taiwan, and you, Kareem, with respect to Iran, do you see any action either by the Chinese or the Iranians to take advantage of this sort of chaotic period, or alternatively, maybe more likely, I don't want to prejudge, actions on the part of the Trump administration while they still have the con, so to speak, to constrain, to do things with respect to China, Taiwan, or Iran that could be particularly dangerous. Now, don't all rush to respond. Who wants? Kareem, you want to?
I'm happy to. Yeah, I'm happy to jump in first, and it is an important question. I think they're both concerns about what the Trump administration might do and what Tehran might do during this transition. Let me first focus on the Trump administration. So there was a piece in Axios yesterday about how the Trump administration plans to ramp up sanctions against Iran on a weekly basis between now and Biden's inauguration in late January. And I thought what was significant about their strategy is that the sanctions that they're going to levy against Iran are not going to be primarily against Iran's nuclear program. It's going to be sanctions targeted to Iran's support for terrorism, support for radicalism in the Middle East, sanctions against Iran's missile program, and sanctions against Iran's domestic human rights abuses. And I think the reason why this is significant is that it will be more controversial, more difficult. The optic won't look as good for a Biden administration. It'd be one thing to come and lift sanctions against Iran's nuclear program if Iran decides to relax or curtail some of its nuclear activities. But Iran is not going to be improving its domestic human rights record. Iran is not going to be changing its regional behavior, and Iran is not likely to curtail its missile program. And so it'll make it more difficult. It'll be a more difficult argument for a Biden administration to make that we should remove these sanctions that were put in by Trump administration. So that's the US end. On the Iranian end, I think there's always a danger that Tehran feels that it's going to need to show that it's not weak. So the Biden administration doesn't have any illusions that they could potentially use the leverage which they'd be inheriting from a Trump administration in order to try to renegotiate a tougher deal with Iran, a better deal with Iran. So there is a danger that Tehran may try to do something provocative, whether that's expanding its nuclear program, something provocative in the Middle East. But I think looking at the glass half full, Iran certainly doesn't want conflict between now and the inauguration of Joe Biden, and I'm very doubtful that that's something a Trump administration wants to see either.
Yeah, Evan.
I can do China. I can do this the same way as Kareem, the American side, and then the China.
Good. Good.
I think on the American side, there are two kinds of people in the administration currently. There are people who would like to burn the house down with China, and they have 70 plus more days to do that before they leave office. Then you have people who'd like to box in and constrain the options and opportunities for the Biden administration to have a reset with China. The second is definitely in play, but if you look at the tools that are being used, they're mainly tools that would box in the president only in a political sense, not in a legal sense. The tools they're using, the use of the Commerce Department's entity list, making Chinese companies toxic by listing them on certain public lists, security gestures, these are things that are being done, for example, by executive order, and therefore can be reversed also by the executive order of a new president. So really the calculation that Mr. Biden will have to make and the people in his administration is how do they manage the politics if in fact they wanted to reverse things rather than so much of a legal designation. But I think there is a determination to box them in, and I do think the politics are constraining. But I also think, as I said earlier, that the Biden people are more in a realm of continuity rather than wholesale break with many aspects of the Trump policy. Now, there is the question, as you flip to the Chinese side, of how the Chinese would react to some of these gestures. By and large, the Chinese have responded to American gestures over the last 6 to 9 months in a what I would call a proportional way. The United States adopts visa sanctions. The Chinese adopt visa sanctions. The United States goes after company X. The Chinese show that they can pull certain kinds of levers. I would not presume that that will remain symmetrical forever. And there will come a time where the Chinese will start to pull asymmetrical levers in response to things that the United States might do. But generally speaking, I think it is possible that the Chinese could be provocative, but that the disincentives there are considerable. For one thing, they would eliminate the possibility of a reset that they obviously want with the Biden people. And I think we have a tendency to think of Chinese policies in a way that mirror images. If you take Taiwan as an example, they've been ratcheting up pressure on Taiwan pretty systematically, not just in reaction to what the United States has done in the short term. That's a long-term policy that the Chinese are unrolling. And there isn't some kind of binary where right now we're at peace and then next Tuesday the Chinese will roll tanks up the beaches. At some point, they will ratchet up the pressure over a period of time that's designed to shape Taiwan's behavior and American behavior and that of others. And I think that's kind of a steady state ratcheting up of pressure on Taiwan and other partners around the region that the United States looks to constrain China rather than a short-term next Tuesday, next Wednesday reaction. So it's a low probability, high impact event. And like Kareem, I don't think they're looking for conflict, but I do think they're constantly reminding the United States and others that they have levers to pull, including some asymmetrical ones.
Right. Thanks. Rosa, I didn't mean to leave you out of this. Is there anything you can imagine for good or ill that any European country might want to do during this transition period? Or something the Trump administration might do that would be disruptive?
I think Trump's attention to Europe has been sporadic, so I don't imagine that he'll want to do something particularly disruptive in the next 70 days. It just hasn't been at the focus of his mind. There are two things. The first is that, and we talked about Britain, Brexit. I think Biden has been quite clear that he doesn't want the UK to not reach a deal with the EU that would jeopardize the Good Friday Agreement. And he's mentioned that, he's Irish. He's of Irish descent. So I think that there is an immediate impact, given that the negotiations are ongoing as we speak, and they have entered the final stage. There is a potential impact of simply the electoral results that the UK and the EU might even reach a deal. So that would be a positive outcome without actually having done anything, which is quite interesting. There's another somewhat paradoxical potential outcome, and that it was reported today that the EU might be issuing retaliatory tariffs against the US. They had refrained from doing this earlier. They had the green light from the WTO. It's about Airbus. They had the green light from the WTO a couple of weeks ago, but didn't want to interfere in the electoral process. and it looks like they might agree to doing this week, and the optics would look pretty bad, I have to say. Also because we know that Trump killed the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TTIP idea, but it was a difficult issue on the European front, not just on the US front. So to start picking, a minor battle on this right now, the optics, I think, will not look good.
Yeah. All right. A question on not a pet peeve, but it's I guess there are pros and cons. One of the most specific initiatives that the president-elect has talked about is a global summit on democracy. I can understand the advantages of such a thing, to re-inject values and ethics back into the frame of American foreign policy, to counter the perception that America prefers authoritarians and dictators. But are there downsides? I don't want to prejudge the question. Are there downsides in a first year of convening a global summit on democracy? You'd have the definitional problem, of course, of what is a democracy and who's going to show. It's also exclusionary, right? I mean, if you're serious about resolving the world's problems, obviously there are actors in the international system that are not democratic, with which we're going to have to deal. But from the perception of your respective constituencies and clients, what about this idea? Does it make sense? Kareem, you follow an obvious authoritarian with politics, but nonetheless, what do you think? Or is it irrelevant to Iran?
No. I think it's a very relevant discussion to the Middle East, because these two of the core impulses that President Biden has are somewhat in contradiction with one another in the Middle East. One is to repair relations with American allies, with American partners, and the second impulse is to restore democracy and stand again for democracy. And of course, none of America's partners in the Middle East, with the exception of Israel, are democracies. So I think, in particular, I see a tension here in a country like Turkey, which has been a long-standing American ally, key NATO ally, in a very important geographic location, which is central to one of the world's greatest humanitarian challenges in Syria. But at the same time, you've had an Erdogan government which has grown more and more authoritarian. So where do those impulses lead you on Turkey? Do you try to repair the alliance, or do you try to stand for democracy? I think it's going to be a real challenge. The other thing I'd say, and this is more in particular with regards to Iran and perhaps some of the Gulf countries, I think that after a couple of decades trying to spread democracy in the Middle East, there's very little bipartisan support for that policy of America trying to export democracy in the Middle East. And so I think the words we should start to use instead of promoting democracy or regime change is simply support for civil society and essentially civil rights, along the lines of the civil rights movement that we had in the United States. And it's always a work in progress. There's still members of the American polity that are still gaining their civil rights. So that would be the way I'd look at it. And in places like Iran or in places like Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. But I think Turkey is going to be one of the real contradictions between Biden's impulse for restoring alliances and for restoring democracy.
Evan, the perception of a global summit for democratic nations convened in Washington at a high level during the first year. Well, it's the era of COVID, so who knows whether this is even remotely, I doubt it, possible. But how would the Chinese perceive such a thing?
Well, I think the more interesting question is how the rest of Asia would perceive the thing, including Asian democracies. I mean, I'm an old-fashioned balance of power kind of guy. So I think there is a values and ideologically based element to the competition between the United States and China. they have a different system, they have a more statist approach to the economy. So it would certainly highlight that element of the competition, but that's not the whole competition. And that's one of the things that I think many in Asia have choked on as the United States cast to the competition with China has become more ideological. Because a lot of Asian governments, including Asian democracies, tend to have more of a balance of power view of their region as well. So one challenge is that if you want to take strategic competition seriously with China, first you have to work with non-democracies like Vietnam. Second, Asian democracies themselves don't agree on regional governance. Things like data standards, India and Japan are not on the same page. And third, for problem solving, things like climate, at some point you got to figure out how to get China in the room, right, where function would drive form. So that's the challenge, but it would certainly highlight the values component, and I mean that has its benefits.
Rosa, this is not a new idea. They had the Communities of Democracy initiative, I think around the year 2000 going forward. What is this irrelevant, a waste of time, important from the European perspective?
I think European countries would go along with it, but it might not be their preference. First of all, there's some kind of, it reminds me of Obama's speech in Cairo in 2009, and a bit of, then the Arab Spring came, and then, democracy didn't quite come about revolution was suppressed and dictatorship returned after the Arab Spring in many countries in the Middle East. And Europeans have been watching this. And they are a bit allergic to ideas such as regime change and democracy support, and they've shifted a lot. And I agree with the focus on civil society rather than on democratic change, because democratic change has been harder to support in Europe, also because of the democratic involution in Europe itself. The EU as a whole would prefer a focus on the transatlantic partnership rather than on a community of democracies. But having said this, there are also, in some countries, European countries are supporting ideas, to give new impetus to multilateralism. And there's an initiative for multilateralism in which both France and Germany are participating. And if multilateral, and the EU, it's part of its DNA to support multilateralism. If the EU could contribute to an initiative that might lead to a regeneration of multilateralism, then they could put aside their, shall we say, ideological hesitations in favor of that. Because, and ultimately, it seems to me that the goal or the intentions behind this idea of a summit of democracies is really to change the way in which international politics have been functioning, and to find a group of like-minded countries which will be more or less democratic. Some may not be quite so as democratic as we may wish, but who are committed to international discussion and cooperation rather than unilateralism. And this initiative, framed in this way, would get European support.
Intriguing. All right, final question for the three of you. We should have allotted more time to it, but short answers to a very difficult question. America's all about reinvention, redefinition, rebirth. Baseball is the image and the metaphor, of course, every spring. Mm-hmm. We have the New Deal, we had the new freedoms, we had the new frontier. Christiane Amanpour, on one of Carnegie Connects, made an observation that despite the wreckage and damage caused by the Iraq War, the second Iraq War, the transition from Bush 43 to Obama, European in particular, desire to say, hello, Barack Obama, goodbye, George W. Bush. Here's the Nobel Peace Prize, by the way. That transition actually took America from a position of the lack of credibility, in large part because of the war, to a sort of redemptive state. So I'm not drawing historical parallels here. My question to each of you is, do you have a measure of faith in America's recuperative powers? Not forget what happens here, which is the real story, of course, and the real challenge, fixing America's broken house. But when it comes to its role in the world, How optimistic, realistic, pessimistic are you in terms of America regaining a measure of stature and confidence abroad within the next 4 years? And I realize that depends on what policies a Biden administration is going to pursue, but just in general, Kareem, could I start with you? Briefly, we're probably going to run out, but I'd really like to hear a minute from each of you.
Sure, I'll be brief. I am optimistic, Aaron, just because I feel that if you were to survey most countries around the world, especially most countries that aspire to be more prosperous and free, if given the choice between partnering with the United States or partnering with Russia or China, there's an obvious preference for the United States. They want to send their kids to study in America, not Russia or China. So I am optimistic. What makes me a little more pessimistic is our domestic politics and polarization. Yeah. This view among folks that their internal political adversaries are a more dangerous threat to the United States than external political adversaries. And that's not something that we have a good solution for yet.
Thank you. Evan?
Yeah, I'm optimistic too. I mean, I think fundamentally the United States has a lot of strengths, economic, in terms of innovation, in terms of its military. I think, like Kareem, the obstacles are largely political rather than structural. And until we get that domestic politics right, it'll be hard to find the expression of that. I think the other thing is that many of our leaders have increasingly found themselves the internationalist leaders of an increasingly isolationist country. I'm not referring to President Trump here. I'm referring to others on a bipartisan basis. And I think mobilizing American popular support for a forward American role in the world, albeit within limits, is going to be a political challenge too. There are a lot of our fellow citizens who are not interested in kind of playing that role anymore, either on the trade front or even necessarily on the security front. And that's what bipartisan leaders of goodwill and good faith have to find a way to sort through the politics of and then communicate with the American people around.
Thank you. And Rosa?
I too am optimistic.
Wow.
Yeah, but I think it will be important to think about US leadership differently. It's for Europe needs to think about co-leadership. And I think this would be a positive outcome for the rest of the world, in the sense that if we think about leadership as more the result of cooperation rather than the result of top-down politics. And I think, we talked about the declinist narrative and relative decline. The world is increasingly diverse, and diverse voices want more space, and maybe the US and Europe need to make room for that space and think about international leadership in a different way.
I won't use the term morning in America. That's already been taken, but I'm really glad that I asked that question, because I agree wholeheartedly. And I want to thank you, the three of you. It's an honor to have you as Carnegie colleagues. I mean, again, I'll repeat, your capacity to combine what I call thematic altitude from 30,000 feet with the real authority that you command on the granular side of knowing how these actors react and providing ground truth to all of us is really impressive. So I want to thank you for joining Carnegie Connects, and I want to thank our viewers. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of your questions, but look forward to the next show. So thank you. Well, stay healthy and definitely stay happy.